Hi, I'm Zahar, and welcome back to the Weekly Point with Z. Now, it's been a couple of weeks since the last episode, so I hope you've got a chance to check it out. If not, then I really invite you to do so because, as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, this is a limited series on the socioeconomics of Lebanon, which will be structured over different episodes. And today we're going to attempt to pick up from exactly where we left off a couple of weeks ago and build up on some of the key themes or key information that was discussed then. Now, before I start and before I jump right into the topic, I wanted to thank each and every one of you who provided me with feedback and those who left me comments on YouTube. This is exactly what I was looking for, and this is the intent out of this entire personal project of mine, which is to interact with people, share information, share ideas, and my hope is to provide you with value by providing informative content, which at the same time provides an unorthodox take on some of those topics that I'm discussing, but at the same time is somewhat entertaining, if I dare to say that, given that most of the topics are serious and my manner of portraying those is serious as well. But at least it would provide you with some form of entertainment in the way of thinking about these topics from a different angle. So thank you very much. And based on that feedback, I've decided to shorten the episodes and focus more on one or two themes per episode to allow for a detailed conversation and a concentrated one, and then allow us to grasp some of these concepts before transitioning to other themes. So this series, you'd notice that this series would be spread out across different weeks and a longer period of time, but the weekly episodes will be much more focused and concentrated. Now, to jump right into this week's topic, what I would like to do is recap on some of the historical context behind the establishment of modern-day Lebanon, how the French decided to grant the area of Mount Lebanon independence within the region of wider Syria because it had a majority Christian population with a significant minority Druze population. And that when they wanted to establish the country around Mount Lebanon, around the region of Mount Lebanon, they soon discovered that the country could not survive in its current limited geography because it doesn't have enough agricultural land to raise vegetation, and that it would be dependent on its surroundings for food and food security. So what they decided is to add some territories in the north, which were Sunni Muslim majority territories, and then add some territories to the south, which were Shia Muslim majority territories, but had a significant Sunni minority as well. And both regions had a Christian minority, a sizable Christian minority, but it was an Orthodox Christian minority rather than a Maronite or Catholic Christian minority. So what this led to is it kind of diluted the majority of Christian communities within the country. They had a slight majority of around 55%, where in the mountain it was a much higher percentage. So what the French did to guarantee that the Christians would still rule that newly founded nation, which was the intent to begin with, they've handed over the country in a very significantly symbolic manner, where they handed over the reins of the country to the Maronite Christian patriarch at the time in a very symbolic gesture to kind of cement Christian rule over the country. Now, what this did is it provided the Christian Lebanese control over all sectors of the economy, whereby they controlled every economic sector from banking to tourism to services to government to education, healthcare, media, just to name a few. So they controlled all economic sectors in the country. Now, what this did is it set a precedent whereby you've got a community dominating all aspects of life in the country, and that is protected by the West or a Western power or a foreign power or an exterior power external to the country. And this started a vicious circle. it started this circle where every community in the country feels entitled to dominate, is vying for power, doesn't see any issues with ruling and dominating the country and marginalizing everyone else. And it also provided justification for foreign intervention. So now you've got different factions all aligned to external powers, believing that they have a justified right to be protected by these foreign powers. And that opened the door to all sorts of interventions or interventionalism. Because if you got Christian communities that are protected by France and Western powers, then you might as well have Sunni communities protected by Saudi Arabia and have Shia communities protected by Iran and have Alawite communities protected by Syria and so on and so forth. It set a precedent that is very dangerous, and it allowed all of these different parties a carte blanche or a free hand in deciding who to align to in terms of foreign powers and who to persecute internally for the sake of dominating the country. Now, interventionism aside, there's another ugly side to that equation. And interestingly enough, the most worrying thing about the state of Lebanon is not the crisis itself. It's the Lebanese people. What worries me about Lebanon is that if you have a conversation with anyone from any faction or group, they would cite the same grievances and they would approach this from the same angle and they would have the same views, which is nonsensical. Everybody would tell you that they're victimized, they're oppressed, they're deprived of their rights, that everybody else are getting their full rights, that they're not getting their fair share of the resources, that they're targeted because of their religion, and that they have an absolute necessity to stay in power, oppress everybody else to make sure that this is no longer the case in the future, including those in power. If you have a conversation with anyone who is associated with Hezbollah, they would tell you the exact same thing. Although they are in power, although Iran is dominating the region, they would still tell you that they're victims, that they're oppressed, that they're not getting their rights, that the government, which they control, does not care about them, and that they need to stay in power to make a change and make sure that this is no longer the case in the future. And if you have a conversation with anyone else from any different group, they would tell you the exact same thing. You would hear things on local news, which is very shocking. You would hear someone saying, "Oh, but I'm worried about the rights of Christians. Oh, but I'm worried about the rights of Muslims. Oh, but I'm worried about the rights of this or that." No one in the country is able to talk about the rights of the Lebanese. They can't think of themselves as one nation, one people. It's impossible for them to grasp, which is very worrying. I think it's the most worrying thing in the country, because for me personally, beyond the right of worship and building houses of worship, everything else becomes a right for everybody within the country. It's not a right for this faction or this. It's a common right for all citizens within the country. They fail to see that, which is immensely worrying, because you can't find consensus. You can't find middle ground. You can't find a middle ground, and you can't look into solutions to problems, let alone understand problems, if you can't agree that the problem impacts everyone equally, and that there's someone who's oppressing everybody else. It doesn't make sense if everyone is oppressed. And the country is unable to progress forward because it fails to come together around this very basic understanding. Like, if I want to elaborate further on that, there's a very standard approach to resolving problems. Sorry. You would start off by identifying a problem, agreeing what the problem is, identifying a list of potential solutions, shortlisting those solutions, analyzing the risk of every solution, making a decision on a preferred solution or two, and then putting together an action plan and a timeline to execute on that solution. We're not even at the stage of analyzing the problem because no one is able to agree with others within the country about what the problem is or how the problem is impacting everyone. It's so narrow-minded that everyone thinks whatever grievance they have is unique and it's the only ultimate truth. And what's even more worrying than that is the fact that it's not backed up by any empirical, statistical data. There's no access to information. There's a willful ignorance not to look up data or ask questions around how the economy is divided, who's getting what, and based on what. Like, you would hear all of the Lebanese asking about their rights, but no one understands what rights they have. No one even understands the law. No one even understands how things are distributed within the country. I would ask anyone about unemployment, they wouldn't have an answer. I would ask about Social Security, about job allocation, about the division of labor in the economy, about the division of resources, about economic sectors, about who owns what, who owns which property, who controls which sector, who controls which companies, who controls which government entities, and they wouldn't have an answer. There's a willful ignorance not to look into this. It's as if everyone realizes that they're getting more than they should get out of that pie, but at the same time, everyone is very vocal about the fact that they're not getting enough of that pie. It's like there's this duality of denial and victimhood at the same time, and it's very confusing. It's hindering the ability of the country to start looking into problems, let alone find solutions. Because everybody's self-observed and self-centered and focused on their faction or their group. And this is what I find the most worrying about the country. It's not the crisis. You could find solutions to any crisis, including giving up. That's one solution, like giving up and declaring it a failed state and hitting the reset button. It's not a likely solution. It's not a popular solution, but it is a solution nonetheless. And if they could agree on that, then at least that's progress. That's one step further. But no one is able to get to a point where they could baseline the problem, have a consensus around what the problem is and how everyone has grievances and what those grievances are and how they're backed up by data. So they can't reach a point where there's an ultimate truth that would provide a pivot stone or a stepstone to move forward. And that's the most worrying part about the country. Now, if I want to use an analogy, an example of some sorts, it's as if each party is baking a tiny piece of cake, a tiny cake with missing ingredients. And everyone is failing to see that if they come together and combine their inventory of different ingredients, they could bake a much bigger cake with each getting a piece much bigger than whatever initial cake they were trying to bake. And in my opinion, this is extremely odd and nonsensical because with the current crisis, people have nothing left to lose. So they're not even willing to take a chance on one another when they've already lost everything. They're still hung up on the idea that I'm the victim, I'm oppressed, I need to get what I need to get, and I need to get it by power, by getting control over the country, and by oppressing everybody else. Now, I'd like to conclude this episode here and allow you the time to reflect on this, because obviously this is a very odd realization, and I think you could notice it's a very, and I guess you could see that I'm passionate about it. Now, I look forward to seeing you next week in next week's episode, where we're going to talk about the different causes or root causes for the current economic crisis as a step further in our discussion, in order to lay the groundwork for the episode that will come after this, and would discuss potential solutions to the current crisis. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.